The aftermath of defeat, particularly one as crushing and all-encompassing as the one that hung over the land, is not easily described in simple terms. It is a dissonance of feelings, a subtle chaos, and a deeper sense of bewilderment. The streets, once teeming with life, purpose, and purposefulness, had fallen silent. People moved through their cities like ghosts, haunted not only by the memories of what had been lost but by the very presence of a history that could not be erased. The buildings, bombed and broken, were nothing but empty shells, pale, hollow remnants of a once thriving civilization. It was as if every piece of rubble carried with it the weight of history, a reminder of a time before the war had ravaged everything they held dear. In this world of despair, the sound of footsteps echoed in every empty space, a reminder that something had been taken from them, something irreplaceable. The sense of defeat was not merely about the loss of a battle but the loss of a way of life. How could you go on when everything you had known and loved had been reduced to ash and stone? People were not just physically broken. Their spirits had been shattered, splintered by the constant pressure of occupation, the relentless pounding of a war machine that knew no mercy. Yet, what was perhaps more insidious than the devastation itself was the presence of shame. It clung to the people, uninvited yet all-encompassing. It was a kind of shame that ran deeper than any military loss, a shame that was cultural, personal, and impossible to escape. This new reality was a far cry from the life that had once been. The streets that had known laughter and the quick, purposeful footsteps of a confident populace were now eerily quiet. People shuffled, heads down, avoiding eye contact, as though afraid to confront the change that had so fundamentally altered the fabric of their existence. There was a kind of disbelief in the air, a sense of horror, perhaps, that the familiar had become foreign. Gone were the days when they had walked with their heads held high, the days when their voices were heard not only within their borders but across the world. Now, those same streets were ruled by foreign boots, foreign orders, and foreign eyes. The sight of soldiers on every corner, their guns and uniforms a stark reminder of their subjugation, only deepened the sense of humiliation. As people moved through this altered world, they carried the invisible weight of occupation in every step. The feeling of oppression wasn't just physical, it had seeped into the minds and hearts of every citizen. Even within the supposed safety of their homes, people could not escape it. The sense of fear, that constant companion, was always present. It wasn't simply the fear of punishment for disobedience, it was a broader, more insidious fear of living in a world that had been turned upside down, of knowing that every choice they made had consequences. Even their most basic actions, gathering food, meeting a friend, stepping out to take in the cool evening air, carried with them a risk. Each of these seemingly innocuous tasks could potentially lead to disaster. Trust, once freely given, was now a rare and precious commodity. Who could they trust? Could they trust their neighbors? Their friends? Their families? Everyone was suspicious of everyone else. This atmosphere of paranoia bled into the daily routine of life, poisoning even the simplest of moments. What was perhaps most painful for the people was the erosion of their dignity. The very essence of who they were had been taken from them, piece by piece. What they had once called their own, identity, culture, language, heritage, had been stripped away. Under occupation, they were no longer masters of their own fate. They were subjects, dependent on the whims of a foreign power. The humiliation was not just in the loss of power but in the realization that they had no control over their lives. Their destinies had been wrested from them, replaced by a new, alien order. It was as if their past had been erased, and in its place was an ugly, foreign truth that they could not escape. At the same time, the people were unable to express their grief, their pain, their anger. There was no outlet for the storm of emotions inside them. How could they mourn when every public expression of emotion could lead to suspicion, arrest, or worse? Silence became both a shield and a cage. For the few who dared to speak, there were only whispers, words passed between closed doors and behind curtained windows. The very act of resistance, of standing up and saying no to what had been imposed upon them, was a dangerous and almost suicidal gesture. People learned to live with their grief, burying it deep inside, even as the world outside their homes continued to deteriorate further. Yet, it was not only the visible, physical world that had changed. The very nature of relationships was transformed. Even families, once close-knit, felt the strain of occupation. The bonds that had once held them together, shared experiences, shared dreams, had frayed, stretched thin by the oppressive weight of the outside world. Husbands, wives, and children had begun to look at each other through different eyes. Could they trust each other? Could they speak freely? The very fabric of what it meant to be part of a community had been stretched to its breaking point. People were forced to live in a state of constant surveillance, a state of constant fear, not only of the occupying forces but also of each other. The weight of the past was not something they could escape, and yet they had no choice but to live with it. This overwhelming sense of fear and shame became the new norm, the new reality that people had to contend with every day. The external horrors of war and occupation were enough to break even the strongest of spirits, but it was the internal toll, the psychological damage, that would leave lasting scars. People no longer recognized themselves. They had become something other than what they once were, shaped not by the decisions they had made but by the foreign forces that had descended upon their land. The question of identity had become far more complicated. Who were they now? What had they become? In this shattered world, there seemed to be no way forward. The future was uncertain, and the past was a constant reminder of everything that had been lost. Yet, even in this bleakness, there was something that began to stir. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something more fragile than hope. The awareness that something, somewhere, might still be possible. The smallest flicker of that ancient human instinct to survive, to rebuild, to stand up in the face of impossible odds, began to emerge. It was a faint, barely noticeable stirring. But it was enough. For the moment, however, that flicker was dwarfed by the weight of fear and shame. It would take time before that quiet resilience could grow. And it would require something greater than mere survival to reclaim what had been taken. But as people continued to walk their broken streets, heads bowed not only by the burden of loss but by the presence of shame, they began to understand one crucial truth. This silence, this feeling of being trapped in their own land, would not last forever. The question was never if they would rise again. It was how. And more urgently when. The occupation dragged on, each passing day a constant reminder of the war's unrelenting grip on the people. It was no longer a matter of surviving the day or week. It became a test of endurance that stretched time itself. With every new dawn, the citizens were faced not just with the bleakness of their circumstances, but with the quiet erosion of their very sense of identity. Fear permeated everything. It was no longer just a fleeting emotion. It had settled deep within the soul of the nation, nestled in the heart of every home, every workplace, every school, and every street. It was omnipresent, a constant, oppressive weight on the shoulders of every citizen. Fear had become a way of life, so ingrained that most could no longer remember what it felt like to be free of it. The people were prisoners in their own land, locked not just by walls and boundaries, but by the mental chains that had wrapped themselves around their minds. Every corner, every building, every encounter could be a threat. It was a world of hushed conversations, of lowered voices, of furtive glances exchanged in shadows. Nothing could be taken for granted anymore. To say the wrong thing, to look at someone for too long, to act even slightly out of line could result in punishment. There were no real rules, only the oppressive presence of the occupiers, who decided what was permissible and what was not. The lines between right and wrong had become blurred. The people no longer trusted themselves to make the simplest of decisions. How could they when everything they did seemed to carry consequences? The government, or what remained of it, had little power or authority. In its place, the occupying forces held sway over every aspect of life. The sound of military boots marching in the streets became a constant background noise, as inevitable as the rising sun. Soldiers, young men who had never seen the lands they were now patrolling, moved with the kind of ease that came from knowing they were not to be questioned. The civilians had learned not to challenge their presence, their orders, or their demands. If there was any resistance at all, it was quiet, isolated, and carefully concealed. Children grew up in a world where normal childhood games had been replaced with a constant awareness of the dangers surrounding them. They were taught, not in school but by the unspoken rules of everyday life, to watch and listen with caution. Trust was a commodity in short supply. No one was entirely safe, not even in their own homes. Families grew weary of the endless strain, of the constant vigilance required to simply stay alive. Parents who had once been free to nurture their children's dreams were now bound by the harsh reality that survival itself was a daily struggle. The small joys of life, of shared meals, of quiet moments together, had been replaced by an undercurrent of anxiety. What had been an ordinary day could turn into a nightmare in an instant, and so everyone had to remain on edge. Every door that opened, every knock at the window, sent a ripple of anxiety through the family. Was it a friend, or was it a soldier? Was it a familiar face, or was it someone who would deliver news that would change everything? The struggle for basic necessities became a constant reality for the people. Food, medicine, and even clean water had to be carefully rationed, carefully protected. Black markets flourished, and those who could sought ways to procure what they needed outside the gaze of the occupiers. But even in these underground dealings, fear reigned supreme. A wrong move could mean not just the loss of food or supplies, but the loss of freedom, or even life itself. For those who did not have access to these hidden channels, the situation was even more dire. They were at the mercy of the occupying forces, who controlled everything from the price of bread to the ability to travel freely. People stood in long lines, not knowing if there would be enough food by the time they reached the front. They could see the soldiers moving among them, some aloof, others openly hostile. There was no recourse, no appeal for the common citizen. If you were caught taking more than your share, or if you were accused of hoarding, the consequences were swift and severe. Life in the city was reduced to a grim routine. Wake up, eat what little food you could find, go out, work under the watchful eyes of soldiers, and return home before dusk. It was a world where the smallest deviation from the norm could be seen as an act of defiance. The occupiers had made it clear that their authority extended to every part of life, from the most important decisions to the smallest gestures. You did not stand up against them, you did not question them, you did not protest. And if you did, you faced the consequences. What was most devastating about this existence was not just the oppression, but the way it slowly, insidiously destroyed the spirit of the people. It wasn't just that they were afraid, they had begun to doubt themselves, to lose the sense of agency that had once defined them. Their very humanity seemed to slip away, piece by piece, as they learned to keep their heads down, to speak in whispers, to live in fear. How could you act when every choice you made could lead to catastrophe? How could you think when the fear of reprisal clouded every decision? Even the simplest acts of rebellion had been twisted into dangerous, often futile, gestures. For those who attempted to fight back, the consequences were often worse than the initial act of defiance. The occupiers had made it clear that resistance would not be tolerated, and so the people had learned to stay silent. Any outburst, even one of sorrow or anger, was seen as a threat. Even a glance in the wrong direction could invite suspicion. Yet beneath this blanket of fear, a kind of quiet resistance began to form, born not of loud defiance but of small, subtle acts of survival. People continued to gather in secret, to share news in hushed voices, to help each other as best they could. Resistance was not always visible, but it was always present, hidden in plain sight. People continued to find ways to endure, to make it through the darkness, despite the overwhelming weight of the occupation. But this survival came at a cost. It was not enough to live through the occupation. The people also had to reconcile their own sense of dignity and worth. How could they continue to survive in a world that seemed designed to crush them, to rob them of their identity, their freedom, their future? The answer lay in something more fragile than hope, something far more difficult to cultivate. It was the simple, quiet determination to continue, to endure, to live with dignity in the face of undignified circumstances. Even as their world was torn apart, the people of the occupied land held on to something within themselves, a tiny spark of resistance that they refused to extinguish. Though the weight of fear, of silence, of shame pressed heavily upon them, the people could still remember, faintly, the kind of world that had once been theirs. A world where they had walked with their heads held high, where they had made their own choices, where they had known freedom. It was a distant memory, but it was still there, buried deep in their hearts. And as they moved through the daily rituals of their subjugated existence, the longing for that lost world never fully disappeared. It was this longing that gave them the strength to keep going, to keep surviving. It was a fragile, quiet resistance, but it was enough. For even in the darkest moments, when fear ruled every corner of their lives, the people knew one thing with certainty: they would not be broken. The British forces arrived quietly at first, their presence understated yet unmistakable. It was a moment marked by the slightest tremor in the air, a subtle shift that could easily be overlooked by those who were too weary from years of occupation to truly understand its significance. There was no fanfare, no grand speeches or immediate celebrations. The war had already dragged on far too long for any illusions of a quick resolution. Yet, for the people who had lived in the shadow of oppression for so many years, the arrival of the British was like a breath of fresh air, a wind that brought with it the promise of something more, a flicker of hope that they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in so long. It wasn't just the sight of foreign soldiers on their streets that struck them. It was the way the soldiers carried themselves, the way they smiled, the way they didn't seem quite as foreign as the occupiers who had made their lives a constant struggle. The soldiers, though still very much the bearers of military power, were different in ways that felt almost inconceivable. They didn't impose themselves as conquerors, nor did they walk with the cold, indifferent air of those who viewed the citizens as mere subjects. Instead, they offered something that had been absent for so long: dignity. It wasn't something that could be quantified or immediately understood, but it was there, nonetheless. These British soldiers, scarred by their own experiences in the war, wore their smiles like a beacon, like a quiet promise that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Their approach was not one of rigid control but of measured patience, of understanding the deep trauma that the citizens had endured. They weren't there to rule, they were there, it seemed, to help. For the citizens, this was a shock to the system. They had grown accustomed to the harshness, the suffocating weight of their occupiers' demands, to the terror of living under the watchful eyes of soldiers who saw them as little more than potential threats. To be greeted, even in the most formal and restrained way, with a smile, was like a balm to wounds that had been open for too long. There was something disarming about the British soldiers, something almost human about them, that set them apart from the forces who had held the nation in their grip for so long. It wasn't that the citizens immediately trusted them, nor that they believed the arrival of the British would solve all their problems. No, the trust had to be earned, and that would take time. But for the first time in years, they allowed themselves to hope, just a little, that the future might hold something better than the stifling present. The soldiers' arrival marked more than just a military shift. It was a psychological and emotional turning point. The people who had been walking through their lives like shadows of themselves suddenly felt the weight of their own humanity return to them. It wasn't as though they were suddenly freed from the chains of their past. The scars, the trauma, the fear, all of that remained. But there was something about the British soldiers' gentle demeanor, their respect for the people's dignity, that stirred something deep inside them. It was a return to a sense of self that had been lost, a sense that perhaps they could reclaim their place in the world. The British soldiers didn't simply offer protection or control, they offered something far more subtle, hope that they might once again walk in the light of their own identity. As the British forces set up their presence in the occupied land, they began the quiet work of restoring some semblance of order, though this was not immediately apparent. The system of military governance was still in place, but it was one tempered by the recognition that the people were not simply subjects to be governed, they were human beings who had suffered immeasurably. This understanding led to a subtle shift in the way life was conducted. The daily grind of survival, so fraught with anxiety and uncertainty, began to feel less suffocating. For the first time in years, there was the possibility of breathing, of living without the constant fear of retribution hanging over every decision. The people began to go about their lives, tentatively at first, as if unsure that the changes would last. But there was no denying that something had shifted. They had not yet found freedom, but they had found a glimmer of something that they had long thought lost: dignity. The soldiers began to interact more openly with the citizens, offering not just their presence, but small acts of kindness, gifts of food, gestures of respect, the willingness to listen. It wasn't enough to heal the wounds that had been inflicted over the years, but it was enough to allow the people to begin to believe that they might someday heal. It was an act of rebuilding trust, one small step at a time. It was not just the tangible acts of aid, though those were crucial. It was the recognition that the citizens, in their brokenness, were still worthy of kindness, of respect, and of attention. For the first time, the people felt that they were more than just victims, more than just the downtrodden masses who had been crushed under the heel of occupation. They were individuals, each with a story, each with a history, and for the first time in years, they were seen not as numbers or faceless masses but as human beings. That recognition, that small but powerful acknowledgement, was transformative. It didn't erase the years of suffering, nor did it promise an immediate end to the occupation. But it did something far more profound. It restored their sense of dignity, piece by fragile piece. In the early days of the British presence, there was a quiet, almost surreal atmosphere. People went about their daily lives, unsure of how to act or what to think, but still holding on to the faintest shred of hope. They had been so accustomed to silence and fear that the return of normality, however tentative, felt like a strange dream. The streets, once empty and haunted by the soldiers of the occupying force, now felt different. The British soldiers didn't patrol with the same air of aggression, nor did they occupy every corner. Instead, they mingled, sometimes laughing, sometimes sharing small moments of camaraderie with the citizens. The sight of these interactions was jarring at first, and many found it hard to believe. Could this truly be happening? Could the people who had suffered so much, been subjugated for so long, actually be given the opportunity to live without fear? The British didn't promise immediate change, and they didn't pretend that the road ahead would be easy. But their arrival was a silent acknowledgement of the fact that dignity and respect were not privileges to be granted, they were rights that had been unjustly taken away. And in those first small gestures, those smiles, those kind words, those moments of solidarity, there was the possibility that something larger could take root. The people had lived under the weight of oppression for so long that they had forgotten what it meant to be treated with dignity, to have their basic humanity acknowledged. But in the space of a few weeks, something began to shift in the collective consciousness of the people. They began to feel seen once again, to feel the presence of life in the world beyond mere survival. The British presence was not the panacea that would instantly solve all the problems of the occupied nation. There was still a long road ahead, filled with uncertainty, conflict, and the aftermath of years of war. The scars left by occupation would not be erased overnight. But the first step had been taken. The first crack had appeared in the wall of fear and shame that had held the nation captive for so long. And in that crack, however small it was, there was light. The light of possibility, the light of a future where the people could once again walk in the streets with their heads held high, where they could reclaim the dignity that had been taken from them. It was a slow, fragile process, but it was a beginning that would, over time, lead to something new. As the British forces continued to establish their presence, the slow, deliberate process of restoration began. It wasn't the kind of rapid, sweeping change that would be expected from a victorious army, nor was it the quick, dramatic shift that often accompanies the end of an oppressive regime. No, the changes were subtler than that, quiet ripples that spread through the lives of the people like the first signs of spring after a long, harsh winter. The scars of the past, the occupation, the war, the relentless suppression of their dignity, were deep, and they couldn't be healed overnight. But the restoration was happening nonetheless, one small act, one quiet gesture, one cautious step at a time. For the people, it was like awakening from a long, oppressive sleep. The fear that had been their constant companion for so long was beginning to dissipate, replaced by something less defined, less concrete, but equally as powerful. It was a sense of hope, though it was fragile and tentative. The people had learned to live without hope for so long that the mere possibility of it now felt like a foreign concept. And yet, there it was, slowly working its way into their lives. The British soldiers, though they wore the uniform of military power, were not the same as the occupiers who had ruled with an iron fist. There was something different about them, something more humane. They weren't the conquerors. They weren't there to impose their will on the people. Rather, they were there to help rebuild, to restore what had been broken. Not just the physical infrastructure, but the very fabric of the nation's spirit. The British didn't come as saviors, but they did bring something precious, the possibility of dignity. For the people who had lived so long under the weight of shame, the prospect of dignity was both foreign and familiar. It was familiar in the sense that it was something they had known once, long before the war had ravaged their land. It was foreign because it had been so long since they had experienced it, so long since they had felt that they were deserving of it. But now, slowly, almost imperceptibly, dignity was beginning to return. The British soldiers did not promise an easy road, nor did they suggest that everything would be fixed in an instant. What they offered was a simple, quiet respect, an acknowledgement that the people had suffered, that they had been wronged, and that they deserved to be treated as human beings again. For the first time in years, the people were allowed to see each other not as subjects of an occupying force, but as individuals with the right to their own lives. They were allowed to look at each other without the constant fear of betrayal, without the constant anxiety of being watched. It wasn't that they were free yet, far from it. But the sense of being a person, a whole, undivided being, began to return. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start with. The British didn't come in with grand proclamations or promises of sweeping change. They came in with a quiet recognition of the people's humanity, and that, in itself, was transformative. In the early days of the British presence, the city streets, once devoid of life, began to take on a new energy. It wasn't an explosion of joy or celebration, but rather a slow, steady revival. People began to gather again, tentatively at first, but with a sense of purpose that had been absent for far too long. They began to speak to each other more freely, to share their thoughts and their hopes, even if those hopes seemed distant and uncertain. The streets, once so haunted by fear and silence, began to fill with the quiet murmur of conversation, of people reconnecting with each other in a way they hadn't dared to do for years. They were rebuilding not just their city, but their relationships, their communities, their identities. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was happening. The British soldiers, for their part, were not blind to the complexity of the situation. They understood that the wounds of occupation couldn't be healed by a simple smile or a kind word. They knew that the people had suffered, and that the process of rebuilding would be slow and painful. But they also knew that they had something to offer, something that had been missing for so long: respect. They didn't see the citizens as obstacles to be overcome or enemies to be defeated. They saw them as people who had endured unimaginable hardships, who had lived through years of fear and suffering, and who deserved the opportunity to rebuild their lives. And so, they began to act not as rulers but as partners. They offered their help not with the expectation of gratitude or loyalty, but with the understanding that the people needed more than just physical aid. They needed their dignity back. This was not a one-sided effort. As the British soldiers interacted with the people, they began to realize that the process of restoration would not be as simple as providing food or shelter. The people, too, had to play a role in their own recovery. They had to begin to believe again that they were worthy of a future, that they could rebuild their lives and their society. The British soldiers didn't tell them this, nor did they preach it. But they lived it. Through their actions, through the way they treated the people, they showed them that it was possible to stand tall once more, to walk through the streets without fear, to speak without looking over one's shoulder. The most remarkable part of this rebuilding process was that it wasn't just about restoring what had been lost. It was about creating something new, something that could not be fully defined by the scars of the past. For the people, this was a difficult concept to grasp. They had lived for so long under the shadow of defeat and occupation that they had lost sight of the possibility of a future beyond that. But slowly, through small acts of kindness, through a recognition of their worth, the people began to see that there was something more than survival. They could rebuild, they could create, they could be more than just the victims of a war they hadn't chosen. As the weeks passed, the people began to take small steps toward reclaiming their lives. The markets, once empty and abandoned, began to fill with people again. The streets that had once been desolate, haunted by the ghosts of those who had been taken away or disappeared, began to hum with the quiet activity of daily life. It wasn't that the people had forgotten their past or the trauma that they had endured. No, that would never be forgotten. But they had begun to understand that, though the past had shaped them, it did not have to define them. They were more than their suffering. They were more than their shame. And with every small step, every quiet victory, they moved closer to reclaiming the future that had been stolen from them. The British soldiers, for their part, continued to offer support, not in grand, sweeping gestures, but in the small, quiet moments that made all the difference. They helped repair the infrastructure, they offered medical care, they ensured that food and supplies reached those who needed them most. But more than anything, they offered something intangible: respect, kindness, and, above all, the opportunity to rebuild. They didn't ask for gratitude, nor did they expect recognition. They simply acted, knowing that the restoration of dignity and the restoration of community would take time, and that this was the most important task of all. The people, in turn, began to understand that their recovery was not just about waiting for things to get better. It was about actively participating in their own restoration, about making the choice to rebuild, piece by piece, day by day. They began to speak out again, to demand what was rightfully theirs, not with violence or anger, but with quiet resolve. They began to hold each other accountable not just for survival, but for rebuilding the society they had once known. A society that had been torn apart by war and occupation but was now beginning to reassemble itself, not in the image of what it had been, but in the image of what it could be. In this process of slow restoration, the people learned an invaluable lesson. Dignity cannot be given, it must be reclaimed. It is not something that can be bestowed by a foreign power or external force. It is something that must be found within, something that rises from the rubble of oppression and flourishes in the spaces where fear and shame once reigned. And in those quiet moments, as the British soldiers continued their work and the people began to rebuild, the first true signs of healing began to emerge. It wasn't just that they had survived, they had begun to live again. As the days stretched into months, the people found themselves living in a strange new world, one in which the grip of fear that had once suffocated them began to loosen, but never fully released its hold. The British forces, still present and steadily offering their support, had helped to restore some semblance of dignity and normalcy, but the emotional and psychological toll of years under occupation weighed heavily. The scars, though not always visible to the outside world, ran deep. And it was not simply the external pressures of occupation and war that had taken their toll, but the internal burdens of shame, loss, and doubt. The return of some sense of freedom was a fragile thing, and even though the visible signs of oppression had lessened, the wounds of the past were not so easily forgotten or healed. The people were no longer subject to a foreign military, but the ghosts of what had transpired still haunted their every move, their every decision. The problem wasn't simply survival anymore. It was what came after survival, the process of healing, of reconciliation, and of self-restoration. The British soldiers, despite their best efforts, couldn't offer this. They could offer protection, food, and infrastructure, but they couldn't offer the people what they needed most: a way to reconcile with themselves, with their past, and with the weight of the shame that lingered. It wasn't the occupying forces they needed to overcome anymore. It was the internal war that had raged in their hearts and minds. For so long, they had been reduced to survivors, just scraping by each day. But now, with the physical occupation lifting, the people had to face the question that had been buried for so long. Who were they now? This internal reckoning was both quiet and profound. It did not announce itself with dramatic speeches or public acts of defiance. It was felt in the stillness of the night, in the way people looked at each other, in the long pauses during conversation, in the moments when they reflected on the years of fear, loss, and humiliation. The people had been subjected to so much, had been reduced to mere shadows of themselves, that to now look at themselves and ask who they were, without the weight of occupation, without the shadow of defeat, was a terrifying proposition. In a way, it was easier to live with the memory of the oppression, easier to stay in the familiar, even if that familiarity was born from shame. To face the reality that they could rebuild, that they could regain what had been lost, was both exhilarating and daunting. The question that now loomed larger than any other was whether the people could forgive themselves for what they had been through. They had endured so much, had lost so much, and had been reduced to the point of shame that, to many, it felt impossible to reclaim their dignity. How could they forgive themselves for letting their country be occupied? How could they ever face the world again, knowing that their collective identity had been so deeply affected by the years of suffering and subjugation? The British soldiers, though well-intentioned, couldn't answer these questions. They could provide the tools for survival and rebuilding, but they couldn't offer the kind of healing the people needed. That kind of healing had to come from within. It was in the quiet conversations that people began to confront their own demons. They spoke not of grand political ideologies or national pride, but of personal shame, of guilt, of the feeling that they had failed their country, their families, and themselves. There was an intense, almost unbearable weight in these conversations. This was not simply about the occupation. It was about the deeply ingrained belief that they had allowed it to happen, that they had been too passive, too compliant.